Fieldsports groups claim shooting is under threat from over-regulation. You can't shoot a magpie in Wales, but you can in England. The Scottish Government plans to restrict the use of gundogs, and DEFRA wants a ban on lead airgun pellets. Aim to Sustain, the partnership of rural organisations, including BASC, the Countryside Alliance, and the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, is fighting back by making the case for self-regulation in shooting. They're collecting evidence about how shoots benefit the countryside, and they want you to take part.
This tool, it will enable us to collect a lot of data, which will help us to formulate and consolidate good practice across game shoots and across all the shooting community. And that's incredibly valuable as we develop self-regulation and thereby providing confidence to government and the general public that the shooting community is a force for good for nature conservation, rural economies, and these wider social benefits as well that we are increasingly recognising.
Scotland is on the cusp of making shooting grouse more difficult and introducing a licensing regime for grouse moors. The Scottish Government says it's trying to counter claims of poor and illegal practice by gamekeepers.
In response to Professor Werrity's review that was published in November 2020, the Scottish Government ignored recommendations to consider a licensing scheme should incidents of raptor persecution not significantly decrease over the following 5-year period. Instead, it was decided that anyone who shoots grouse, whether driven or walked up, should be licensed, and a public consultation was launched at the end of 2022. The Wildlife Management Grouse Bill is also being used as a vehicle to introduce restrictions relating to trapping and snaring, as well as muirburn.
The Welsh Government says it's anti-shooting. It's set to ban snares. One risk of new legislation is that antis in government can use it to introduce wider restrictions than politicians originally promise.
If we don't have effective self-regulation, then I think it's fairly clear that there will be statutory regulation, and that statutory regulation would involve wider stakeholder consultation, and it will involve many that are not directly involved in game management or indeed have a moral objection to game shooting. And so that could negatively impact the sector, which then could potentially be damaging for the environment, rural economies, and the social benefits that we know that shooting provides too.
A number of concerns have been raised by rural organisations, and some are technicalities within the bill which will make the administration more onerous than it should be. There are major questions over who should be licensed and what this means for landowners. As it stands, the wording is such that any wildlife crime committed on that land may result in the licence being revoked. This is in direct contradiction of the reason why the bill was brought about, which was specifically to tackle raptor persecution alone.
Aim to Sustain hopes that the results of its shoot survey will later arrest the spectre of raptor persecution by gamekeepers, which the RSPB and others use to tarnish the image of shooting.
Most shoots and most people involved in shooting operate to very high standards, but it's always the minority that are the ones that are bringing the sector into disrepute. And these are the ones that unfortunately hit the headlines. And so all the good work, the positive work that goes on, tends to go unnoticed or is underreported. And I also sense that there's a growing frustration within the shooting community that it feels misunderstood or misrepresented. So Aim to Sustain, as an umbrella organisation, seeks to address this, and through the development of a set of self-regulation standards, this will help the sector be viewed in a more positive light by those who question, for example, the environmental credentials of shoots.
GWCT research shows that when shoots follow best practice guidelines, they deliver biodiversity benefits.
Self-regulation, it can only really be effective if all those who are involved are actively engaged in that process and indeed on board with the self-regulatory mechanisms that will likely develop over the next few months.
The Scottish Government continue to squeeze every sector within rural Scotland. Wildlife management and shooting in general are really under the cosh, and the knock-on effect is ultimately a negative impact on endangered species and a reduced income for thousands of rural workers and employers.
There are 3 parts to the survey, which is open until the end of January. If you'd like to take part, see the links below.